Warzone has a lot of problems, and I'm probably not the first person to tell you that. Since you clicked on this video, that probably means you're generally interested in listening to commentary about the game, which also means that you're no stranger to the many complaints that players have about it. They want less ridiculous cosmetics, they want less skill-based matchmaking, they want different looting mechanics, and then they want a new map, and then they want the old map back, and I could go on for another hour. But I would never make an entire video about any of those things. I mean, sure, they're annoying, but they aren't the problem with a capital T and a capital P. Have you ever heard of survivorship bias? Maybe you've seen this image floating around Twitter. As a super quick explanation, during World War II, analysts studied planes that came back from battle to see where they were most often hit, and then they recommended reinforcing those areas. What they failed to realize, however, is that because these were the planes that managed to return safely, that means they were hit in areas that were already non-critical. They were hit in areas that could afford to be hit, and that's why they still made it back safely. In reality, if you're trying to keep more planes in the sky, you'd have to take a look at a plane that did crash, or maybe at the spots of a surviving plane that were unscathed, because those would be the real problem areas. You hear people complain about cosmetics or looting mechanics or an overpowered weapon, but those complaints come from people who still play the game. Not that they aren't valid, but they're just not enough to make them walk away. Or in other words, not enough to knock the plane out of the sky. And yet, year after year, Warzone becomes less popular, so there is at least something that's actually making players quit. And I have to say, I wish it were as simple as weapon tuning, because that kind of thing is relatively easy to address. I think that the real problem that Warzone has always had is one that can never be fixed. I know that sounds dramatic, and believe me, I will explain everything in excruciating detail in this video. But first, we have to go back to a time when no one was complaining about Warzone, because I think that's where we'll find our answer. In March 2020, Call of Duty Warzone launched as Call of Duty's first ever free-to-play product. Warzone was a battle royale mode built within Modern Warfare 2019, the current Call of Duty game at the time. As always, if you wanted the full game, you'd have to pay full box price, but anybody could play just Warzone for free. In the beginning, the game mode was a focused and gritty battle royale experience. It was a runaway success from day one. It had all the battle royale elements that were so trendy at the time, but with a Call of Duty spin. Most battle royales were centered around scavenging randomized loot as you fought to survive in an ever-shrinking map. Warzone did have this, but it also allowed you to create your own customized loadout that was obtainable in-game. This was a key change because creating your loadout is a cornerstone of traditional Call of Duty gameplay. And Infinity Ward, the creator of Warzone and Modern Warfare 2019, found a way to weave this into the full battle royale mode. But maybe the most amazing thing Warzone did from a business perspective was create very strong synergy between Warzone and the rest of Modern Warfare 2019. You could hop into the traditional multiplayer experience to level up the same weapons that you were taking into Warzone. Not only was this possible, but it was actually the most effective way to level up. Playing Modern Warfare 2019 allowed you to unlock attachments and cosmetics for your weapons much faster than if you were only playing Warzone. So this was a best case scenario for Activision. Warzone was free to play and sold the same cosmetics that they were already making for Modern Warfare 2019. And while they could say that Warzone wasn't technically pay to win, buying the fully priced Modern Warfare 2019 would allow you to unlock new weapons and attachments quicker than free-to-play only players. While it had its flaws, these were the good days. Warzone and Modern Warfare 2019 more generally had an identity. It knew what it wanted to look like, it knew what it wanted to sound like, and most importantly, it knew what it wanted to play like. It was lean and mean with only one Warzone map, which received seasonal updates, and a moderate amount of weapons, which also grew season to season. Standard stuff for a live service battle royale like Fortnite or Apex Legends. But at the end of the day, Call of Duty inherently is not like those games, which is a great segue into what you're here for, the part where I tell you just how crappy Warzone is. As we all know, there are only 3 certainties in life: death, taxes, and a new Call of Duty game every year. COD is one of, if not the highest selling video game in the US every year. So it wasn't surprising when Activision announced that Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, God, I hate that title, would be releasing in November of 2020, just 8 months after Warzone released. And now, all of a sudden, the huge success of this new game mode was beginning to pose a problem. Traditionally, when a new Call of Duty comes out, the previous one stops receiving updates entirely. This is because everyone is playing the new game, and also because those developers need to start working on their next Call of Duty. But for the first time in forever, players weren't done with Modern Warfare 2019 after its year-long life cycle was up, because they wanted to keep playing Warzone, the same way that people want to keep playing Fortnite or Apex Legends even past 1 year. And while we'll never know for sure, it seems like Activision was also surprised by this. I don't think they originally had plans to support Warzone after Modern Warfare 2019 was done getting updates. Like I said, that kind of thing was unprecedented for Call of Duty. But you don't just kill something as successful as Warzone was. Doesn't matter how prepared or unprepared you might be. And so they figured something out. When Black Ops Cold War released, all of its weapons and cosmetics were crammed into Warzone. I can't imagine this was easy because Modern Warfare 2019 and Black Ops Cold War were two different games, on different engines with different approaches to time to kill, recoil, visual effects, animations, everything. But they found a way to port over the weapons visually and then completely rebalanced them for Warzone. Which, as a side note, in my opinion, kind of negates the whole thing, because this meant that if you used a Black Ops Cold War weapon in multiplayer, it would feel completely different than it did in Warzone, but that's beside the point. This had to be done to maintain that synergy that we talked about, to make it so that Warzone and Black Ops Cold War had a mutually beneficial relationship instead of being at odds with each other. But still, this came at a great cost to the heart of Warzone. I think if you surveyed 1,000 OG Warzone players and you asked them when they thought the game started to get worse, most of them would point to the Black Ops Cold War integration. They might have different problems with what was actually going on at the time, but they would all be around that time frame. This was the moment where the identity of Warzone, everything from its aesthetic to its gameplay, was compromised in order to keep the annual release train moving forward. This is the biggest problem Warzone has and always will have. Not Black Ops Cold War specifically, but the annual release cycle. A new game every single year that Warzone has to conform to. A new game every year that has to have all of its content crammed into Warzone. This doesn't just ruin one aspect of the game, so let's break this down piece by piece. Here is the first major way that Warzone has been sabotaged by the annual Call of Duty release: bloat. When Black Ops Cold War was integrated into Warzone, the amount of weapons available in the game essentially doubled overnight. This is the kind of thing that maybe at first sounds amazing, like look at all this new content that the game has, but ultimately at this scale, it just dilutes the gameplay and makes each individual weapon feel less special. And by the way, this is assuming that all of this content actually works and is balanced when it arrives in the game, which it didn't and it wasn't. This integration was so rushed that most of these weapons were just outright broken. Some attachments did nothing to them, some even did the opposite of the stated effect, and weapons like the DMR were extremely powerful, completely blowing any other weapon in the game out of the water. But even after all of this stuff was ironed out, the game was still much worse off than it was before, in my opinion. The tricky thing about weapon balancing in Call of Duty is that the time to kill is generally pretty fast, so there isn't a lot of room for a large number of distinct weapons to coexist, especially in a popular category like assault rifles. For example, how do you carve out a clear place in the meta for the M4A1 from Modern Warfare and the XM4 from Black Ops Cold War? These are two weapons that are each other's counterparts in their respective games. They were never meant to exist in the same one because they serve the same purpose. It's redundant to have them side by side. You could say the same about the MP5 from Modern Warfare and the MP5 from Black Ops Cold War. They literally have the same name because they're meant to do the same thing. They're the same gun. So it's hard to justify having them both in the game beyond cosmetics, I guess. Even factoring out the Black Ops Cold War integration, Warzone was always eventually going to run into this problem if they kept adding weapons. Like I said, it's just the nature of Call of Duty gameplay, especially when you consider that the gunsmith also allows you to fine-tune how any given weapon performs, which further blurs the lines between what each gun is meant to be used for. You add it all up and it just starts to feel like a big melting pot. Weapons don't have individuality anymore. Sure, you can have a weapon that you feel attached to, but there are 6 or 7 others that can do the exact same thing that that one can, so it's not functionally special in any way. In order for a live service to thrive long term, developers need a mode of adding new things into the game. In the case of Warzone, one of those things has been weapons. But in a game like this, how are you supposed to be excited when the 50th assault rifle is added to the game? Does it change the way that you can play Warzone? Does it allow you to do something that you couldn't before? The answer is sadly, no, it doesn't. And as a reminder, this didn't just happen with Black Ops Cold War. Again, when Call of Duty Vanguard came out in 2021, all of its weapons were shoved into Warzone. The funny thing is that at that point, the bloat problem was already so bad that adding another 30 weapons to the game probably didn't even make it much worse. It's just a drop in the bucket at that point. Now, you might say that developers handled this issue with weapon balancing, i.e. when a new game is integrated into Warzone, they make sure that all of those weapons are the most powerful, effectively making the massive pool of old weapons useless since they can't hang with the new ones. And sure, I guess this kinda solves the weapon duplicate problem, but this is no way to manage the game long term. As a legacy player, it feels like you're being cheated, like the rug is being pulled out from under you. And as a new player, you feel overwhelmed. Why are all these weapons in the game if they're not meant to be used? It's like they're just there to clog up the menus at that point. Bloat is a problem that any live service will eventually have to deal with if it survives long enough. But Warzone was particularly not equipped to handle it. Because of the loadout system and the fact that people had paid for premium weapon skins, I think they felt that they couldn't take any weapons out of the game. And in their defense, I'm sure some people who bought weapon skins would have been pissed if they did. But this all just speaks to the fact that Warzone, from the very beginning, was poorly designed as a long-term live service. In fact, I don't think it was designed as a long-term live service. Because like I mentioned, I don't think anyone was thinking about what Warzone would be after Modern Warfare 2019's life cycle was up. But that's enough about the bloat, you get the idea. How else does the annual release sabotage Warzone? With each passing year that a new game is integrated, Warzone's gameplay becomes more and more disjointed. For example, in the original Warzone, which, as a reminder, was designed by Infinity Ward as a part of Modern Warfare 2019, there was a feature called weapon mounting. This allowed you to mount your weapon on something in front of you to reduce your weapon's recoil at the cost of being completely stationary while shooting. While I never loved weapon mounting, I think it worked within the context of Modern Warfare 2019's gameplay. Now, fast forward 2 years to when Call of Duty Vanguard comes out. You can still mount your weapon, but they put an interesting spin on it this time by allowing you to slide side to side while mounted. It seems kind of odd to me personally, but Sledgehammer had their reasons for putting this into Vanguard, and within the context of Vanguard, it was fine. But, of course, to maintain synergy between Warzone and the current Call of Duty game, this feature had to be integrated into Warzone 2. Remember that Warzone's DNA was designed by Infinity Ward, but now we're adding in elements from other games made by other developers, which, to be honest, have nothing to do with Warzone. So it ends up creating this weird hodgepodge of mechanics with no coherent design philosophy. This is a small example, of course, and I doubt this ruined the game for anybody, but you can see how it makes the gameplay disjointed and eventually starts to feel like the game is just a mix of random crap. There's no consistent vision for the way it's meant to be played. Because over the years, every single Call of Duty developer is putting their little touch into Warzone. Because of Sledgehammer, weapons with 10 attachments were introduced to Warzone. And then Infinity Ward removed slide canceling and reload canceling. Sledgehammer reintroduced slide canceling and reload canceling along with tactical stance. And then Treyarch overhauled movement completely with Omni movement. This is not the way that a live service should work. A tug of war between different developers who all want the game to be something different. There should be a singular team of people who have a vision for what the game is and how they want it to play. And they shouldn't have to worry about what the flavor of the week is going to be from a different developer who just so happens to be making the current Call of Duty. As a quick note, I want to mention that technically, yes, Raven Software did eventually take over as the permanent and primary developer of Warzone. I think that happened sometime around Vanguard, but as we've seen, they're really more just there to help match Warzone with whatever the current Call of Duty is. They clearly aren't in charge of the game creatively. All right, so we've talked about bloat. We've talked about Warzone's disjointed gameplay. The last thing I want to mention, which is similar to the gameplay thing, is how the annual release cycle contributes to Warzone's major lack of identity. We just talked about how it ruins any chance that Warzone had at a consistent gameplay identity. But this also hurts the aesthetic of Warzone 2. Modern Warfare 2019 was set in modern day, obviously, and had a very grounded and militaristic look. I've heard it described as tactical. And I have to say that Infinity Ward nailed the aesthetic there, and I think they really captured what people have always loved about the Modern Warfare series, with the way that the operators, the weapons, and even the Warzone map looked. Black Ops Cold World War after that was set in the 90s, so everything from its operators to its weapons matched the setting. Also, Black Ops in general is usually a little more wild, since those games are meant to be a little less realistic than Modern Warfare. So instantly, with that very first integration, Warzone already lost its visual identity. It no longer had that modern militaristic look to it. It kinda did, since those operators and weapons were still in the game, but now you also had zombies and robots and freaking Sylvester Stallone running around. They also changed Verdansk, the first Warzone map, to take on an 80s aesthetic, which I think looked just awful. And that was probably due to the fact that they rushed the integration, but also due to Treyarch stepping in and making changes to Infinity Ward's creation. Similar to the gameplay stuff we talked about, this many cooks in the kitchen is never good. The game's aesthetic was now an awkward mix of Black Ops and Modern Warfare. And by the way, this is coming from a guy that prefers crazy Black Ops games to Modern Warfare stuff. But even I can recognize that trying to do them both at the same time is worse than just fully committing to one or the other. I'd prefer a grounded Modern Warfare aesthetic for Warzone to one that's half Black Ops and half Modern Warfare. This gets even worse when Vanguard comes out the year after that, which is a game set during World War II. Even on its own, people weren't very excited for another World War II Call of Duty game, since that setting is pretty played out within the franchise. But for the 10th time, Activision has to keep Warzone relevant, and that means adding World War II themed stuff to Warzone. So now you've got World War II soldiers running around alongside modern day Captain Price, running around alongside a zombie or whatever from Black Ops. Warzone has no visual identity. It has no gameplay philosophy. Warzone is completely beholden to whatever the Call of Duty game of the year happens to be. And I guess you might be able to make that work, but every time a new integration comes out, they just stack it on top of whatever the current experience is. It's a bloated and incoherent mess. And I think that's what stops players from sticking with the game long term. There's nothing to get attached to, and even if there was, that could easily change with the next integration. The reason that this is a problem that can never be solved is because that would require separating Warzone from the yearly Call of Duty, which would mean that Warzone and traditional Call of Duty would be at odds with each other. They would be competing with each other instead of helping each other out. It would mean that Warzone would need its own team of developers to create and balance weapons, design cosmetics and maps, and they would no longer be able to borrow any of that stuff from the main game. And since they've been able to get away with running Warzone the way that they have been, I'd bet that it just doesn't make sense to them to branch it off into its own thing. Even though I obviously think that in the long term, that would eventually pay off. So all of this being said, let's just imagine for 1 second. In an ideal world, what would Warzone look like? For starters, you wipe everything, and you go back to the original Modern Warfare 2019 state of the game. And I mean everything, every weapon, every cosmetic, and every square inch of Verdansk. I think this is the way to go, since the Modern Warfare aesthetic is what everyone fell in love with back in 2020, and it also sets the game apart from competitors like Fortnite, which are much more colorful and wacky. From there, you do seasonal updates, just like they did back in 2020. Add some new weapons, and update the map with new POIs. I hate that this needs to be said, but these incremental updates help keep people attached to the game. I don't know why, but Modern Warzone has a way of not updating the map and instead just introducing a completely new map every once in a while. I think this adds to the feeling of estrangement that has accumulated in the Warzone community. So for now, let's just do incremental updates to the existing map. As I mentioned, eventually you will have a bloat problem if you keep adding new weapons. This may be controversial, but I think you absolutely have to add a vaulting system. If you wanted, you could just vault weapons for create a class and not floor loot. So even though you wouldn't be able to build a loadout with a vaulted weapon, you might still see it in the game as floor loot. In my opinion, this would keep things interesting. It would force players to engage with the new weapons that are being added to the game and give devs more room to tune the weapons sandbox. It also gives you easy content to eventually add back into the game. So for example, a new season might come with a new battle pass, new cosmetics, 2 new weapons, and on top of that, 2 old weapons that have now been unvaulted. Of course, this would also mean that 2 existing weapons have probably been vaulted, which some players might complain about, but this is the price that you pay in a long-term live service. It's just the way things have to be if a game is going to keep receiving updates for years and years and years. Since in this hypothetical scenario, this would be a fresh start for the game, you could make it clear to players that some weapons might eventually be vaulted, but that nothing would be gone forever. One of my favorite things that Fortnite Fortnite does is kind of a yearly reset, where a brand new map is introduced, the loot pool is refreshed and simplified down, and more fundamental changes like a new movement mechanic might be introduced. I think it would be very important to do something like this every once in a while, keeping in mind that we don't want to repeat any of the issues that we discussed in this video. The gameplay philosophy should remain clear, the aesthetic should remain relatively consistent, and there should be one team of developers who have a long-term plan for the game. They design the maps so they know how the movement mechanics should work. They design the weapons so they understand how the loot economy should work, and so on. To give Warzone credit where it's due, we actually got something like this when Modern Warfare 2 came out in 2022. A complete reset of all cosmetics and weapons, a new map with new mechanics and everything. And I think that was almost the best thing that ever happened to the game. But unfortunately, Infinity Ward had a really odd vision for how they wanted the new Warzone to play, which was painfully slow and boring. In fact, I could probably do an entire video about how bizarre that version of Warzone was, but we won't get too much into that here. And besides, even if that update was amazing, Modern Warfare 3 from Sledgehammer was integrated into it the very next year, so we would have had all of the same problems all over again. Alright, so let's wrap this thing up. I think Call of Duty's yearly release schedule is Warzone's biggest problem. It creates bloat, disjointed gameplay, and a major lack of identity for the game mode. Ideally, Warzone could be its own branch of Call of Duty with its own development team who have a long-term plan for the game and make their own seasonal updates for it based on their creative vision, completely unbothered by whatever Call of Duty happens to be coming out with that year. But unfortunately, I think it might be too late for that. Activision has already gotten that sweet taste of synergy that Warzone used to have with Modern Warfare 2019, back when there was a perfect Call of Duty ecosystem between multiplayer and Battle Royale. And now they're cursed with trying to recreate that year after year, even if Warzone is obviously suffering because of it. This is the one problem Warzone will always have because of Activision's boundless greed. And listen, in the off chance that Warzone does eventually secede from the yearly Call of Duty release, and you're watching this thinking, well, that aged poorly, believe me, I am happy to be wrong. Thank you for watching, and stay gold.